this is the last of our twice weekly thoughts based on the book of Acts. Those of you following along with us will reach the last bit of the story tomorrow. And I hope that as we've read together about the early church and the life of Paul, it has reminded us of what church is, what it should be and what it shouldn't. And part of what we are called to do as God's people, how we are called to be. This is also the last of these thoughts for the foreseeable future. I started doing a thought for the day at the end of last March, and we had 5 a week pretty much consistently for over a year before cutting back to 2 each week in April this year. We've been doing them as a way to keep connected as a church family. As we've been doing them as a small, poor replacement for the interaction that we normally have with each other in person. And I hope that they have been helpful. But now, as the final set of restrictions are about to be lifted, as we begin to meet again, to be able to share fellowship again in a way we haven't for some time, it seems like a good time for these thoughts also to come to an end. Of course, part of the reason that they're coming to an end is that I'm going to be moving on from Potters Bar Baptist Church at the end of this month. And it's time for the church here to start the next part of its journey with the Lord, which doesn't include me. That brings me back to these last chapters of Acts. Over the last few weeks, as we've read together, this book in the Bible has gone from being a story about the early church to being a story mostly about the exploits of Paul. But one of the things that I think is really interesting, and this is a spoiler alert for tomorrow's reading, we don't really know how Paul's story ends. As chapter 28 of Acts comes to a close, Paul is under house arrest in Rome awaiting trial. The story doesn't tell us what happens to him next. We don't really know the outcome of his trial. We don't know whether he went on to preach in other places. We don't know how he died. There are traditions around these things. But Acts certainly doesn't tell us. In many ways, the end of Acts is a cliffhanger. We are still waiting to find out what will happen next. And I love this, because the book of Acts isn't really Paul's story, even though he has been the centre of it for a while. The book of Acts is a continuation of God's story which starts with creation in Genesis and runs through the Old Testament, runs through the Gospels and the life of Jesus. And God's story, that story of Jesus, the story of his church, doesn't end here with Paul in prison in AD 60. That story that we read about in the book of Acts, it carries on. It continues now with us almost 2,000 years later. You and I and Potters Bar Baptist Church, we are part of this story. The story of God and the church and the world, of how God works through the church in the world. We are part of this story. We are the continuation of God's story that has been going on since time began. And so for us, for this church, as we prepare ourselves for the next step in our own small part of that huge story, as we get ready for a time of change, as I prepare to move on to my own next steps with my family, we can journey forwards in confidence that just as God was with the early church that we have read about in Acts, just as God was with Paul, just as Christ worked through the early church and worked through Paul, just as the Holy Spirit empowered the early church and Paul in their part of God's story, so too he will continue to do with us in our part of his story, in the next steps we take with him.